Hey, everybody, welcome to Fulfilled. I'm your host, Rebecca Sheehan. I love today's episode because it's all about finding hope and healing in our broken world, which is such a central aspect, of course, of Christianity. And that is what our guest's life mission is all about. Christ-centered and trauma-informed therapist Tabitha Panariso draws on the gospel to help people overcome rejection and all sorts of trauma. She also recently published a book on the topic called Loyal in His Love. Tabitha Panariso, so glad to have you on the show today.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So yeah, maybe we can get started with your background. Have you always been a Christian, or did you find Christ later in life, and how that led to Christ-centered therapy?
Yeah. I did grow up in a Christian home. My mom actually worked in the church for most of my life. She was in the military and was a chaplain's assistant. And so I spent most of my childhood just hanging out at church while my mom was preparing for events and setting up for services in whatever military base we were at the time. But I would say that while I knew who Christ was at a young age, I don't know that I really devoted my life to him until what I would say was like a hard beginning for me as a Christian was when I was 18 years old, and just felt this conviction, kind of felt like I was looking down the barrel and saying, okay, either I can move into adulthood with Christ or I could do it without him. And what is it that I want to do here? And so it was at 18 when I really said, Lord, I want you to actually lord over my life and what I do with my daily actions. And from there, it's funny, I didn't naturally fall into a ministry space. I spent most of my time as a school counselor, working with kids kindergarten through 8th grade for about 6, 7 years. I loved it. But what was hard about it was knowing that there was so much more I could offer these kids that I was talking to that I legally really couldn't share with them. Wasn't able to publicly share my faith in that way in therapy sessions. Took a break for a little bit. And during that time, I just myself went through such a hard season and was really struggling to find a therapist who shared the same values that I did. Didn't really know where to look. Felt like it was just hard to even talk with churches or pastors and say, hey, do you know anybody? And they didn't know anyone. And so I never thought I would go back into counseling. And I just felt this calling back into it with this specific conviction to be a therapist who is also Christ-centered so that I could occupy the space for other people that I had hoped for and longed for when I was looking for a therapist as well. Because I just knew how important it was to be able to look at our lives in a holistic way, not just from a mental health perspective, but also from a spiritual perspective, because as believers, those things are so entangled. And so here we are today. I get to do that with so many of my clients, and it's such a gift.
Yeah, that makes sense that you couldn't fully help these kids without bringing in the gospel.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about Christian therapy or Christ-centered therapy. Is it its own type of therapy, or is it just something that you infuse different types of therapy with?
Yeah. So without complicating things, there is a group of therapists or counselors, actually, rather, who call themselves biblical counselors or Christian counselors. And their sole focus is really to dive into biblical concepts and utilize that in therapy, which I think is lovely. However, I actually went to school to get my master's degree in counseling. And so when I say that I'm a Christ-centered therapist, what that means is that you are getting all of the same things that you would find in regular therapy, but I'm doing it from a foundation, from an anchor of who Christ is, what that means to us as believers, and how that actually informs the way that we perceive healing and our own transformation and health. And so it really is just something I'm infusing into therapy when clients give me permission to do so. Something that I'm really careful about is not creating a space of condemnation, but just creating a safe place where we can talk about theology in context of what they're experiencing.
So much of therapy is focusing on yourself and your own healing and things that have happened to you in the past. But so much of Christianity is so selfless. I read Mere Christianity a couple years ago, and this quote really stuck with me. C.S. Lewis said, "The very first step is to try to forget about the self altogether. Your real new self will come when you are looking at him." So how is focusing on yourself not self-indulgent and not sort of anti-Christian?
Yeah. Well, the way that I look at it is that who we are was created and formed by God. And so certainly when an artist creates a masterpiece, when we look at the art, we see the fingerprint of the creator, right? And so when we look at ourselves, we aren't looking at ourselves as the solution to our problems. We're looking at ourselves in a way of seeing God in us, how God has created us to see that fully instead of in parts or in its brokenness. And so we want to be able to understand, how are we fulfilling his purpose for us? And what does it look like for our lives to glorify him, to honor him, but also to embody the resurrection, to embody hope and love and grace. And so I think when we are looking at ourselves through that lens, as God is the means to the end, that he is the solution, that really changes things.
And it's just so much more positive with this end goal.
Yeah, I think it just changes the lens, right? I think that's why when we think about self-help books or all of this literature, right, about how can we improve ourselves, ultimately, the reason why that's so unfulfilling is because we want to be enough for our own healing. We want to find the solution within ourselves. But the difference is we're looking to find the solution in God. And because the Holy Spirit dwells in us, right, because our lives are so entangled with our Creator, we can find God within the way that he created us. And it's so freeing to know that we don't have to be the solution to our problems.
That is true. I feel like there's so much pressure that we put on
Mhm.
ourselves if something bad happens to just get over it
Yeah.
or move on. But I always have this image of God just sitting with us
Yeah.
in our pain.
Mhm.
He's not saying get over it. Like we're harder on ourselves almost than he is.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. We have forgotten the grace that he extends us. We have forgotten how to extend that to ourselves in those situations.
I feel like your form of therapy also circumvents or transcends the whole victimhood thing that we see in culture
Yeah.
nowadays, where people sort of celebrate their victimhood as a badge of honor.
Mhm. Yeah, I see why we've gotten there, right? In American culture specifically, we've come through a lot of generations where we aren't allowed to be hurting. We're not allowed to say things are bad. We're more inclined to pretend like everything's okay and pretend like we got it all. And so I think, like a lot of things, we pendulum swing from one extreme to the other. And now we've swung over to, well, these are all the things that are wrong with me, and this is why I am the way I am, and there's no room for changing. Like, this is just it, right? What I try to do in sessions with people is, yeah, let's acknowledge the pain. Let's acknowledge the suffering. We might have to sit here for months or even a year, but then the hope of Christ is to be able to swing back more to the middle, which is this understanding of, okay, well, how does my life get to look different now? How do I get to grow? How do I get to transform? Because Christ does sit with us, but he certainly doesn't leave us there either. He wants to take our hand, pick us up, and move us along to the next thing.
So, how do you get from that point of just sitting in your grief to starting to live with it and work past it?
That feels like such a complicated question. Really, where I sit with clients is grappling with the unresolved questions they have that come from that grief. And sometimes that's questions they have for God. The one that probably 100% of us have asked is like, why? Why is there pain and suffering in this world? Why did this have to happen to me? And ultimately, I think where people can come out of that is often just a place of acceptance for the things that we can't understand, for the mysteriousness of who God is and how God engages in our life. And with acceptance, hope for something better, right? Whether that's the eternal hope of what comes after being here on earth, or just hope in general for what life can look like, even with that loss, knowing that we can experience pain and suffering and also experience hope. And so it's a lot of existential grappling of those heavy and hard questions that outside of therapy, I think a lot of times we just don't let there be room to ask. And so that's the honor I have, is being able to make space for those questions that maybe other people in our life just aren't comfortable with talking about, because it's just too hard sometimes to go there.
One thing that really helps me is knowing that God already knows everything in my heart. So, I might as well just reveal it to myself, right?
Yes. Yeah. And then the relief of actually expressing that, maybe out loud or through prayer. it just feels like a burden is taken away from you when you can just say it instead of hiding it.
All right. So C.S. Lewis, maybe talk therapy is not self-indulgent. I think it actually could bring us closer to God.
Good, good. I'm just saying that's my argument.
So switching gears a little bit, let's talk about your new book published in January, right?
Yes. So it's a book about rejection and abandonment and betrayal. What it is it's my testimony in a couple of short words. I'm kidding. It felt like a lot longer than that. It's just the story of how God worked through my heart when I was experiencing just multiple forms of rejection throughout my life, how rejection really formed me, how for some time I let it define me, and how I moved past that and allowed it to be more of something that brought me to a new life, that transformed me instead of just keeping me in a place of just, I don't know, unable to relate to other people or even really connect with God the way that I wanted to. And so it's a testimony first, but it's also just the thing that I wrote because I knew that there wasn't anything else out there. And I wanted other people who were experiencing what I was experiencing to have something meaningful to hold on to in those times where rejection occurs, because it's just not something we talk about a lot.
That is a really good point. It's almost embarrassing, right?
Yeah.
It's like you think that there's something wrong with you that you were rejected.
Yeah.
And I think that we hold on to that a lot. Like it's hard to get over rejection.
Yeah. I would say that it's possible. I would say that I have gotten over rejection. It scarred me, but I'm seeing those scars heal in ways that I didn't think was possible. I mean, if we're believers in Christ who is resurrected, right, then we have to believe that anything is something to be healed from, that there's nothing that can stand in the way of the power of Christ in our life. And that's really what this book is about, is how the power of Christ is really what can heal us from those scars.
What was the most impactful rejection that you've endured? I'm assuming you don't mind talking about it since you wrote a book about it.
You're right. Yeah, so probably what really is at the core of this book is how when I was really young, my mom and dad got a divorce. My dad was an alcoholic, and so my mom made a really difficult decision in order to preserve, I think, me and to preserve her. And my biological dad stayed in my life for a couple of years, but when I was around 5 or 6, he just completely disappeared without a word. And for the bulk of my life then, I didn't have a relationship with him at all, didn't hear from him. The last time I heard from him was when I was 16, and he was very drunk. And, unfortunately, he passed away, I think, a couple of years ago. And so that's probably been the most significant story of rejection I have. And really what makes me feel so much empathy towards those who experience rejection, because when you experience something like that, a parent especially, someone who is, should love you or have this obligation to you, to experience them walking away and then to hear other people talk about rejection as if it's meant to be this gift in your life. It's meant to be this wonderful, thing that redirects you. It's really difficult to sit with that and reconcile that. And
Especially when it's so significant, like what you went through.
yes, exactly. As a kid, for sure. And so, I really needed a way of making sense of that in a way that wasn't just with platitudes or quotes from the internet, that really just, for lack of a better word, kind of gaslights the pain that you experience through that rejection.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Like pruning. Oh, well, God takes these things out of your life, these people out of your life so you can grow.
Mhm.
God bless the broken road. I mean, there are just so many of those that do make sense in some cases. But yeah, when you're talking about such significant
Yeah.
rejection, and when you think of parents, I mean, there's so many analogies how God is our father. So when your father is anything but,
Yeah.
I can't imagine what that was like, just realizing that this is not like how things should be.
Absolutely. I certainly felt like my relationship with the Lord struggled because of this absence of my biological dad, and really having to work through that and recognize that God is not us. He's not human. He doesn't act human. God is not my biological dad. And what would it look like to live a life knowing God as faithful and loving and kind, even when my dad was not those things?
Are there certain examples in the Bible of rejection that you think are most powerful or most applicable to people's lives? I mean, obviously Jesus is like the big one.
Yes. It's interesting because once I started studying rejection, especially through the Bible, it really became clear to me that the majority of people that we read about experienced rejection. Um, I think about David living in caves, hiding from the king, right? That he was being rejected on a regular basis. I think about the woman at the well and how she felt rejected. I think about Joseph and how his brothers literally left him for dead. So there's story after story of people who are disappointed by the people in their life. I think about the woman who bled for 13 years and what that life must have been like, knowing that other people could not be near her, could not tend to her needs, and the way that she reaches for Jesus, reaches for his coat. And so I really find comfort in that, that this thing that our society doesn't want to talk about, the Bible is very clear. This is a part of people's lives. And this is what the Lord does in response to them. He meets us in the margins. He meets us in the places where people forsake us. And that's just so kind of him to include that so clearly, in this word that we get to read, so that when other people aren't talking about it, God's like, I'm talking about it. This is the story. And like you said, it's the story of what led Jesus to the cross too. And so even more so, knowing that our Savior suffered under the same things that we suffer, um, is just of great comfort.
What do you think is the most impactful part of your book that really like differentiates it from other self-help books?
What I really think sets this book apart is, well, one, I talk about how compassion changes everything for us, but two, lands squarely on the resurrection of Christ. It's fascinating to realize that Jesus's death wasn't actually really remarkable when we think about the context of that time. Crucifixions were happening all of the time to all sorts of people. What makes Christ's story stands out isn't necessarily his death, it's the fact that he rose again 3 days later. And how does that change our life? And so what I want people to take away from the book is, when we live in a resurrected storyline, that changes the way that we heal and it changes the way we treat people. So just as Christ shows compassion to others, even though they forsake him and reject him, we can also do the same thing too. So there's this empowerment at the end of like, this isn't just about our hearts being changed and healed. It's also about how then do we get to engage and interact with the people who consistently turn their backs on us.
What does that look like specifically?
Mhm.
Like when you live that resurrected life after all of the pain?
Yeah. This is where I go gentle because I know that it can be hard to imagine ourselves loving someone who has hurt us. I give a pretty concrete example of how I wrote a letter to my dad when I was about 30. And in that letter, essentially, I forgave him and just said, I want you to know that I have nothing but grace and forgiveness for you. And I sent that letter to him. And that was my way of practicing resurrection. That was my way of extending generosity to someone who has hurt me. And so I share some examples of like, maybe it looks like just praying for someone who you might consider an enemy, right? Thinking more positively about them, trying to understand their story. It might be someone who you see every day. You're willing to actually look them in the eyes and say good morning or hello. And so there's a lot of ways that we can embody that through acts of generosity and just like leaning into them in a way that shares our love for them, not powered through what they did, but powered through what Christ did for us.
Sort of take some of that power away from them and away from what they did when you're able to show compassion and forgive them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tim Keller wrote an amazing book on forgiveness. I think it was one of his last books before he died. And he talks about how forgiveness is only possible because of the vertical forgiveness, so to speak,
Yes.
like the fact that we are forgiven first
Yeah.
for our sins.
Yeah. Not going to argue with Tim Keller. He always nails it, it seems like.
Yeah, right. How do you get people to not blame themselves for what's happened to them?
Mm. Yeah, that goes back to that piece of self-compassion I was sharing about. Probably the most meaningful thing that I experienced in healing was to be able to extend compassion to myself, to extend kindness to myself. And that really started with looking at how I was speaking to myself just on a regular basis. We all have an inner voice. Sometimes that voice is critical because it's self-protective. As you mentioned earlier, a lot of our actions are self-protective. We're afraid to forgive ourselves because we think we're striving to be better. And so really acknowledging that voice and understanding why it exists, and even just showing some compassion to that voice of like, oh, I know that you're doing this because you think it's going to help protect me. But then learning to exchange that voice with a voice of kindness is transformative. And so for some people, that can be hard at first. I think it starts with thinking about who's kind to you in your own life, who has the most encouragement to give you. And you can practice using their voice for a time being until you gain your own voice and how to be compassionate and kind.
I've actually tried that before, like speak to myself like my best friend would speak to me.
Yes.
And I always come back to, man, like I am way meaner to myself than anyone else would be.
Yeah. It's
So,
so
I mean,
hard.
it's hard to kind of sit with that. It also points towards false idols.
Mhm.
It just kind of reveals that we probably care too much what other people think, or we care about
Yeah.
perfectionism when all we really need is God's love.
Mhm. Yeah. My perspective of that has changed slightly a little bit since I wrote the book. I talk about how the reason rejection hurts is because we were created for community. We were created for connection. We see that in the Bible that we are meant to be together as one unified. So the reason rejection hurts is because it's unnatural to the system in which we were created for. And so that's why the pain exists. I think we have to be careful about not shaming ourselves for caring about what people think, because I think that care exists because we know community is needed. However, you're right. And I do talk about this, about how we can platform people or position people above caring about what God thinks, and really just rightfully positioning people where they should be versus putting them above, which then does make us complicit to navigate situations based on them and not on who God has created us to be.
That's really interesting and kind of a comfort to know that it's not so black and white. It's when you put those people up on a pedestal above God.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Because again, it's that less condemnation, right? Like I just think back to so many years of my life of just caring constantly what people think. But that really was coming from a place of like, I just want to be accepted. I just want to be seen and known. And that's such a core of who we are as humans. So why are we trying to completely disregard that? Because I would say on the extreme version of that, people who don't care at all what people think, to me, that's also unhealthy, right? Like there is a solid place, I think, maybe in the middle that is not on either of those extremes.
That makes me worry a lot about the next generation growing up in a social media world,
Mhm.
where you get likes for posting bikini pictures instead of more profound things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really just finding Jesus and making Jesus the Lord of your life, because it really is our motivation that changes everything for us. I'm noticing in my oldest, who is entering into preteen, he has begun to care more of what people think. And it's like, what does it look like to be able to have both in a healthy way, to not be held back from our potential? And so I think knowing who God is the thing that we can really strive for, because it helps us to decide, is this something I should care about? Or is this something that I should let go and release or change? And I think that helps us have discernment. I think that's the most powerful thing we can have. And my hope for the next generation is a healthy level of discernment.
If only all therapy could be Christ-centered like yours, we'd all be in a better place.
Oh, man. We have to know Jesus first, right? I mean, that is really the hope of it all. And hopefully, then, as believers, we all still struggle and have problems, then to meet someone who can sit with them in that and still point them to Christ. That would be a gift for sure.
Yeah, it is such a gift and such a comfort
Mhm.
to have Jesus as we go through these challenges
Yeah.
in life.
Mhm.
So, wrapping up, I love to ask my interviewee if there's a Bible verse that you'd like to share, either one that's been valuable to you or about rejection and healing, that sort of thing.
Yeah. This morning, I was reminded of one as I was reading in my daily devotions, and it was Hebrews 4:16, when it says, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." And I've just been thinking a lot about how the way I draw near to the Lord, the way that I look to Him for provision and for guidance, that is what helps me be who I need to be from day to day, regardless of what I face or the people who don't validate me that while I might not be able to always be bold in the face of others, I can with confidence know that the Lord will give me what I need to continue on. And so that's just been really helpful just in the last year, looking at what the world is going through, but also being a mom, working, just all the different things that all of us are constantly juggling. That is what fills me up and helps me to endure and to keep going.
I love that. And yeah, it is definitely a difficult season, especially as kids go from
Amen.
that young age to the preteen years. So
Yes.
keep up the good work. So, Tabitha, if people want to connect with you or check out your book, where should they go?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram at Tabitha Panariso. I also have a Substack. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically just another web hosting of like blogs and essays. And you could just type in Tabitha Panariso Substack and you'll find mine there. It's called Unseen Things. And it's where I try to do more of this, talking about theology and mental health and life. And as far as the book goes, it's available wherever you can buy books. For the most part, I know it's on at Barnes & Noble, Target online, and of course, Amazon. But I'm an advocate for libraries and local bookstores. And so you can always request to get a copy there too.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Any other books on the horizon or anything that you're looking to tackle in the near future?
You know, nothing right now. I am just sitting in the rest of having completed this big task and really enjoy putting real life conversations to the things that I've kind of held close to the chest for the last 2 years. It's just been so good to hear other people say me too, and to know that I'm not alone in what I've experienced, and just to be able to enjoy and delight in how it's helped and impacted people. So that's the plan, I think, for right now.
That's awesome. And it's just amazing how when you bare your soul like that, it sort of emboldens others
Mhm.
to do the same.
Yeah.
So thank you for bearing your soul. And yeah, what you went
Well,
through sounds like it was very
Thank you for
difficult.
making space today for me to bear a little bit more of myself.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I loved all of your valuable insights. And thank you to all of you, our amazing listeners, for tuning in. Your support means a lot. So if you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Stay inspired, keep trusting in God's plan for your life, and we'll see you next time.